So I'm very happy that you are with us now online, Lucien, to give us an insight into anarchism under different circumstances, different state formations, different from Western Europe. You are a professor at Rhodes University, and you've written a lot of books on revolutionary or syndicalist anarchism. Among them, Black Flame, a book that has been mentioned several times this week already. And today, Lucien will give us a quite broad perspective on anarchism in Africa in two different periods of history. The first period will be from the 1860s onwards, that is with the Western colonial expansion. And the second phase will be from the 1990s onwards, that is with new authoritarian regimes in Africa and under neoliberal conditions. And he will focus on North Africa and Southern Africa, but will also mention some other countries. And I'm very interested in your talk, and welcome, Lucien.
Thank you very much for having me here. When I was originally approached, I was asked really just to speak about some part of Africa, but for some reason I decided I will try to map out some of the story of anarchism and revolutionary syndicalism across the continent. And that's quite a difficult job to do. I mean, Africa is about 3 times bigger than Europe. It's got over 40 different countries. It's very, very diverse. So I made a bit of a rod for my own back, but I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to go into screen sharing a bit to guide the talk. So I will start doing that, and I'm happy. My understanding is I'll talk for about 40-45 minutes, then we'll have questions and answers. So there are many things that could be raised. I'm going to really try to focus on big themes and key events, and I don't want to just give you a sort of long list of this, that, the next thing. But anyway, with that, I'm going to now switch to I'm going to switch now to a fairly modest PowerPoint. Okay. I just want to check, is that visible to everybody? Is that okay? All right. So, I think the first thing we need to really think about here is the question of what do we actually mean by anarchism? And obviously the way that we define anarchism is going to greatly affect what we look at. So I think we'll need to tackle that a bit. I'm also going to argue that it's very important to look at these movements, this current, in its sort of larger context. I don't think we can understand a revolutionary current like anarchism or syndicalism in some sort of abstract terms, as if these are just ideas that float around. There are very particular social conditions which enable and disable these sorts of currents and shape what these sorts of currents engage with. And the ability to engage with the concrete terrain of struggle and have a proper understanding of where you are at in a particular situation is absolutely crucial to building any sort of successful movement. So I don't think about anarchism and syndicalism as some sort of abstract ideas. These are things which exist in particular contexts, and their rise and fall is shaped both by the context, but also by how people in those movements respond to the context. Now, obviously, there's a huge amount to cover. So I'm really going to look at a few key developments and themes. I'm going to try to hit a few highlights. I'm also going to provide some suggestions for extra reading. and sources if you're interested, and that will be towards the end. As was indicated, I'm going to look at two main phases. I'm going to look at the period from the 1860s into about the 1930s, and I'm going to look at the period from the 1980s. My focus is going to be North Africa and Southern Africa. And Southern Africa, to be clear, South Africa is part of Southern Africa, but Southern Africa includes the entire subcontinent, including countries like Zimbabwe or Mozambique. And in closing, I want to just touch on an issue which often comes up, which is the question of, is it useful, is it possible to speak about African cultures as anarchistic? And I think that's quite an interesting discussion, and we'll come to that towards the end. Now, to be clear on the first part, what do we mean? By anarchism, I really do mean what some people would call class struggle anarchism. So I mean a libertarian socialist current. That is to say, a movement that is anti-capitalist, anti-feudal, we could add, but also anti-state. A movement that is against not just exploitation, but domination. So a movement that is fundamentally against hierarchies, and a movement that is really one that wants to create an egalitarian, self-managed, classless society. So it's socialist, but it would not be socialist in a form that would look like something like the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In fact, it would regard a system like that of Cuba or Vietnam or the Soviet Union as not socialist. For it, socialism is an egalitarian, self-managed, classless society based on genuine common ownership and control of key social resources, like the means of production. So we're not talking here about state ownership or private ownership. We're talking about some form of social or collective ownership that allows people to democratically decide, for example, in the economy, what to make, how it should be allocated, how the work process itself should carry on. And how do you get from this critique of the current system? How do you get from a critique of the current statist, capitalist, hierarchical, inegalitarian society? How do you get from that critique to a new type of society? How do you break through? Well, traditionally, anarchism has believed in a social revolution that takes place internationally, a social as opposed to a political revolution. And that would be a revolution by the popular classes, the working class, the peasantry, the poor, the oppressed groups, not oppressed groups in general, but specifically oppressed classes. Where does this come from? Again, this is a crucial issue. You, of course, get many people who speak about anarchism as something which has always existed in human society back to the Garden of Eden, or in various forms of Islam or Christianity in the Middle Ages. I don't think that is the case. I think we can actually date when anarchism, in the sense that I'm talking about, emerges. And it emerges in the International Working Men's Association, i.e., we can see it emerge in the First International. Now, it's older. Marxism precedes it, and nationalism precedes it, and it's partly developed in a struggle with these other ideologies like Marxism and nationalism. And it tries to deal with similar issues, but it tries to deal with them in a different way. And I'd say if we have to want to look for one or two emblematic figures, I think we would be not doing too badly if we looked at Mikhail Bakunin or Bertolt Kropotkin. So when I'm talking about anarchism, this is what I mean. I'm not saying that there are not other forms of libertarian socialism, and I'm not saying there are not other ideas which are very similar, but this specifically, when I talk about a current, this is what it's flowing from. And this is the sort of broad stream in which different tendencies exist. Now, syndicalism from this perspective refers really to a revolutionary type of trade unionism. So the term is derived from the French word for union, syndicalisme, but that's a later addition to the term, a later label. It essentially talks about a type of trade unionism where you would really try to use workplace organizations to fight back in the present, but ultimately to prepare the people to take over the means of production. So the idea of a syndicalist trade unionism is that, yes, it does what a lot of trade unions do, but ultimately it's a preparation. It's a means to an end as well. And that end is literally a social revolution, overthrowing the state and the ruling class. So when I'm talking about anarchism, this is what I mean. When I talk about syndicalism, this is what I mean. And I would again say we can maybe summarize this by saying that at the core of the anarchist project was the building of a popular counterpower of organizations of ordinary people that could resist and then the existing system and replace it with something better, something democratic and egalitarian. And this also required not simply organizing in certain ways. Simply organizing democratically is not enough to make something anarchist. Obviously, many movements organize democratically. What makes it revolutionary is also the revolutionary goal, the goal to change society, and the set of values and beliefs. If you want, I call it a counterculture, but we could say a counter-hegemony among the people. Okay, so syndicalism in this sense is an anarchist strategy. All right, so that's the sort of background, and let's now move on to Africa. Now, I think the context is important. If we look from the 1860s to the 1930s, I think we can think of this period as an early period of globalization. I would really say the first modern globalization. In the 1870s, there's what was then called the Great Depression. It is the first international economic crisis, and it indicates that the world economy had become integrated through capitalism and empire on an unprecedented scale. Now, this was also the period with the rise of gigantic modern monopoly capitalist corporations. So we can think about in the earlier 19th century of capitalism is based on quite a competitive model with many different companies. But from the 1870s, we start to see a pattern of gigantic corporations, which dominate entire sectors and which often span different sectors. And at the same time, there is a relatively open, unprecedentedly integrated international economy. I mean, the levels of foreign investment and of trade relative to GDP are actually as high as those we see by the 21st century. So it's an incredibly open world economy. And it's also based on a massive expansion of communications and transport. So we're talking about things like cheap railway transport, the steamship, the telegraph. It becomes possible to share news almost instantaneously around the world. It becomes possible to mass produce and easily distribute popular press, to literally share photos around the world and news, and there are massive developments like the Suez Canal. And this is also the period of imperialism, classic imperialism, for example, the scramble for Africa from the 1880s, where European countries divide up the African continent and essentially integrate it into the world economy in quite a range of ways, but often quite unevenly, and create either colonial states or establish semi-colonial states, states that are not fully colonial, but that in some way are integrated as junior subject states within larger empires. And in this context, this is where we're moving on to Africa. Africa in this period is incorporated into world capitalism in a way it had never been done before. These large companies move into many African countries. There's a major restructuring of African economies, and there's a rapid growth, and this is where our anarchist story takes off, of the working class. Now, there are working classes in Africa earlier. I mean, for example, wage labor did exist in ancient Egypt, but I'm talking here about a modern working class, and it's centered on things like farms, railways, docks, light industry, and mines. And importantly as well, there's a lot of immigration of workers and migration, workers moving within Africa, from Africa into other continents, and from other continents into Africa. Now, this is the background in which anarchism starts to emerge in North Africa. Algeria, we start to see an anarchist movement from the 1880s. Algeria is partly integrated into France. So the northern part of Algeria is actually integrated into the main French government. Within the northern region, people defined as French can literally vote for parliament and have equal rights. The south of Algeria is run as a sort of occupied territory. And the whole of Algeria has a highly racist and discriminatory legal system called the Code de l'Indigène. So it's quite a racist society. It develops quite a large white population, which is concentrated in cities like Algiers and Oran, and which forms a large part of the working class in these regions. And it's within that white working class that anarchism starts to emerge in Algeria, and that you start to see the first anarchist newspapers, for example, L'Action Révolutionnaire, which emerges in 1887, and you start to see anarchists involved in trade unions. And many of these trade unions are actually integrated into the French trade union movement. They're not considered Algerian unions. Many of them are affiliated to the CGT, the Confederation Générale du Travail, and the Bourg du Travail in France. So the Congress of the Fédération du Bourg du Travail is actually of 1902 is actually held in Algiers. Okay, so you start to get this. In Egypt, you actually start to get anarchism even a little bit earlier. Now, Egypt is quite different in the sense that Egypt remains formally part of the Ottoman Empire. Algeria had been part of the Ottoman Empire, the remnant of which now is Turkey, but is taken over by France. But Egypt remains formally under the Ottomans until about 1914. But what happens is a lot of the government functions are effectively controlled by Britain. You don't get the same sort of racist political system, and there's actually quite a small European population. And this European population, some of it is made up of workers from elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, Greeks, Syrians, and so forth, Italians, and there's also quite a lot of political refugees there. Enrico Malatesta, the famous anarchist, actually lives in Egypt for a couple of years, as does Luigi Galliani. And you start to see anarchist groups there from 1877. For example, an anarchist group from Cairo joins the Anarchist Black International in 1881. Now, did any of these movements manage in these countries, Algeria and Egypt, both of which are integrated into imperialism, are being deeply reshaped by integration into capitalism in quite different ways? Do these anarchist seeds grow local roots? The initial base, as I said, was very often European immigrant workers. A lot of people came to Egypt because work on things like the railways was better paid than jobs in Italy. It's the same reason why many Italians moved to Brazil. Wages were actually comparatively better. I mean, they were very low. But it's the challenge becomes, could anarchism get out of this ghetto of immigrants and exiles? In Egypt, yes. In Egypt, there was quite a conscious effort from an early stage to win over local Arabic-speaking Egyptian people. In 1877, the anarchist wing of the First International agreed to a proposal from a Cairo delegation to start publishing in Arabic and Turkish. Now, that didn't really go anywhere because the anarchist wing of the First International doesn't actually last out that year. However, in 1882, a number of anarchists, including Enrico Malatesta, join an uprising by the Egyptians. It's really led by Egyptian army officers, centered on a chap called Ahmed Urabi. It's an armed revolt, and a number of anarchists, mostly Italians, volunteer to join this armed uprising. Now, that it's not a successful rising, but I think it gives you a sense of the orientation that at least a section of the anarchists had, of the importance of being involved, not just in debates that were happening in Italy or in France, but to engage with the concrete Egyptian reality. And we also start to see anarchist ideas have a modest influence on some Arabic-speaking intellectuals, two of whom are someone mentioned, Salama Musa and Shibili Shamayil. Now, from the 1890s, we start to see two interesting developments. The one is a large part of the anarchists, especially Greek and Italian anarchists in Egypt. I mean, some of the Greeks had been in Egypt for a very long time. They weren't actually immigrants. But anyway, that Greek and Italian section of the working class starts to organize trade unions. Initially, there are efforts at organizing resistance leagues, which are sort of workers' associations. These are not the same as the old guilds that existed in the Ottoman period. But from the late 1890s, they start to try to organize what are called international unions. Now, an international union is a union which is open to all workers. The first of these that is successful is for cigarette rollers. And this cigarette rollers union is one of the first to start to draw in Arabic-speaking workers. In the early 20th century, for example, there's a shoemakers trade union, and the committee running the union, you know, the chairperson and so on, the committee includes Armenians, Syrians, Egyptians, Greeks, and one Italian. So you do start to get something quite interesting here. And in 1921, anarchists are involved in helping form the first National Trade Union Federation, which is called, in French at least, the Confédération Générale du Travail. That also has an Arabic name, and that's formed in 1921. And they have a little bit of an influence on it. And they also helped form the first Communist Party in Egypt in 1921. In Algeria, things are not running on exactly the same lines. I think we can say that for quite a lot of the anarchists in Algeria, their focus was France. They were integrated into quite large French-speaking or white communities. Not everyone in there was French. There was quite a lot of Italians and Greeks, but you know, they were very oriented towards France and French politics. And beyond that, in Algeria, the anarchists were not particularly big. They were not a very big current. They had a smaller membership, less publications than, for example, the moderate socialists, and later the Communist Party. In 1925, an anarchist newspaper published in Algiers called Le Flambeau complained, anarchism lacks influence among the working masses, despite the vast possibilities. And I think we can see a lot of groups were quite small, a lot of publications were quite short-lived, a lot of people didn't stay in Algeria, they moved on. But at least some groups did manage to organize among local Arab and Berber workers, and you start to get a number of Arab and Berber anarchists. So the publishers of La Flambeau, which was the Algiers-based, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, Groupe Libertaires de Afrique du Nord, they had a significant number of Algerian members, one of the most famous of which was a man called Saïd Mohammed, or Saïd Mohammed Ben Amizian, who was an Algerian worker. He lived most of his life in Paris. He was in Algiers in the mid-1920s. He worked with the La Flambeau group. And when he was back in France, he was active in trying to organize Algerian workers, and he later fought in the Spanish Revolution. So we do get this uneven record. I would say in both cases, we can say yes, anarchism did start to establish a presence among local people. And this is quite significant. Now, I'm going to come back a bit later to try to understand why there were successes and why there were failures. I should just mention there was an anarchist presence in Tunisia, especially in the city of Tunis. And in fact, some of the major Italian anarchist newspapers were actually published from Tunis. There were also efforts, for example, in 1926, to form a North African Anarchist Federation. This was initiated by the group that published La Flambeau, and they tried to organize a Fédération Libertaire d'Afrique du Nord, which would include Morocco and Tunisia. And we also know there was some impact because there is evidence of a number of Arabic and Berber anarchists fighting with as part of the anarchist columns in the Spanish Revolution in the 30s, among them Saïd Mohammed. All right, now let's switch to the other end of the continent, Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, we do start to see anarchism emerge from the 1880s. And really the pioneer is an Englishman. He was born in India. He lived in London a bit. He was friends with people in the Freedom Group in London, which was a group centered on Piotr Kropotkin. And in 1881, this man came to South Africa. His name was Henry Glass. Now, Henry Glass is interesting in a number of ways. One, he remained closely associated with the Freedom Group in London. Two, he brought in large bundles of anarchist materials, including by Kropotkin, Malatesta, and so on, into South Africa. And three, from South Africa, he actually was responsible for the translation of a number of Piotr Kropotkin's works from French to English. Now, look, speaking about South Africa in the 1880s is a bit anachronistic because South Africa as a country is only created in 1910. It is a product of the scramble for Africa. At the time that Glass was active in South Africa was really, what became South Africa was made of about 7 or 8 different states. These were conquered by Britain or were already ruled by Britain. There was the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and after that, Britain forged these into one country. Now, he was based in the Cape, in a port city, but he was very active around the country. Now, a very important thing that was happening at this time, and it's something which makes South Africa, I think, quite different in some ways to Egypt or Algeria, is there's the discovery of massive gold deposits in the interior of what becomes South Africa. In the Afrikaner Republic of the Transvaal, which is an independent state in the interior, massive gold deposits are discovered on what becomes called the Witwatersrand. Now, this attracts, in the age of monopoly capital, this attracts 43% of all investment into Africa comes from 1870 to 1936. 43% of total foreign investment into Africa comes to South Africa, and in particular the gold mines. And along with this, you get an explosive growth of the working class. So Johannesburg, which is the key city on the Witwatersrand, goes from a tent town of about 3,000 people in 1886 to a city of 250,000 people by 1913. And a huge amount of this population is the working class. And you get the rise of trade unions, initially amongst white workers and subsequently among black workers. So you have trade unionism emerging at an early stage. And you have within this a number of people influenced by anarchism who've come to South Africa, and they're trying to understand, how do we deal with the situation? And the big issue here is a massive division between white workers, Indian workers, that is South Asian workers, is a significant population in South Africa. Colored workers, which is a Southern African group of mixed descent. I know the term colored means something else for the Americans, but in Southern Africa, it refers to a very specific, very large Creoleized group, if you like, and Black Africans. The thing is, the mines are based on cheap black labor. And there's a continual effort in the mines and in the factories by big corporations to replace white workers with cheap black workers. And this generates a massive antagonism. So the question becomes, for people who identify with anarchism and who talk about class struggle, is what do? You actually can't ignore the racial question. Now, from quite an early stage, we do start to see anarchists trying to organize across the color line. A group set up in Cape Town in 1903, called the Social Democratic Federation, which has got many anarchists involved, sets a general workers' union. And in Cape Town, this organizes across the color line, which is, I think, is the first union in the country to try to do that. A little bit later, there's the organization from 1910 of the Syndicalist Union, Industrial Workers of the World. But while that IWW speaks about interracial unity, it doesn't really get out of the white working class. The big changes really start to happen from 1915. In 1915, a group called the International Socialist League is formed. It is essentially syndicalist. It's very influenced by the Industrial Workers of the World model. And it starts to organize joint actions with Black nationalists in what is now the African National Congress. It also organizes a number of events with the African Political Organization, which is a colored organization. And it starts from 1917 to organize syndicalist unions among Black, Indian, and colored workers. So very significantly, the first trade union for Black workers in Southern Africa as a whole is organized by the syndicalists of the International Socialist League. This is 1917, and this union is called the Industrial Workers of Africa. And it becomes quite a significant union, and we'll come back to that. All right, so meanwhile, in Mozambique, there is also the emergence, and in Angola, of a number of anarchist groups. Now, Mozambique and Angola are Portuguese colonies, and Angola is a huge territory. Historically, it had been used as a massive source of slaves, especially for Brazil. It's a very undeveloped territory. It doesn't attract many immigrants, and anarchism emerges there, but the main population of anarchists are from a group called the Degradados. Essentially, Portugal has a penal transportation system. What that means is for a number of crimes, you will be deported from Portugal to a colony, maybe Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, Angola, Mozambique, maybe imprisoned there, but certainly exiled there. And anarchists are included in the category of criminals who will be deported and therefore become what are called degradados. So in Angola, you do get anarchists, but most of them are Portuguese who have been expelled from Portugal and stuck in Angola, and they form a few groups, but they don't really get anywhere. I mean, one of them is the editor of Abatalha, which is a very popular newspaper run by the Confederação General do Trabalho of Portugal. The editor is actually dumped in Angola. He escapes. His name is Mario Castelhano. He's sent to Angola in 1928. He escapes. He goes back to Portugal. He's caught again. Eventually sent to a concentration camp in the Portuguese colony of Cabo Verde, where he dies. Mozambique is a bit different because Mozambique does develop a significant working class. Mozambique is right next to South Africa, and it's got a big port in Delagoa Bay and a port city called Maputo, in those days Lorenzo Marx, and there a significant working class emerges, and you start to get trade unions, and in those trade unions you start to get a number of anarchists and socialists variously. All right, so do these things form local roots in Southern Africa? In Angola, a little bit. In Mozambique, not so much. In Mozambique, the movement does have a little bit of impact on a group called mestizos, which are similar to coloreds in South Africa, but not quite the same. Also a mixed group. But generally, it doesn't really make a big breakout. But in South Africa, revolutionary syndicalism in particular, through trade union work, has a very significant impact. The Industrial Workers of Africa, for example, merges with other trade unions to form something called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa, the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa. And the ICU becomes the biggest mass Black protest movement in Southern Africa before the 1950s. The ICU union is a mixed bag. It is influenced by syndicalism, it is influenced by Christianity, it is influenced by Black nationalism, it's influenced by social democracy. So I wouldn't call it syndicalist. I would say it had a syndicalist influence. But this mass black and to some extent colored protest movement of over 150,000 adherents by the late 1920s is an echo. It's one of the echoes of syndicalism in South Africa. It wouldn't have taken that form without syndicalism and without the industrial workers of Africa. Anarchists and syndicalists also helped set up the Communist Party in South Africa. First, some of them set up a Communist Party which is rejected by Moscow because it's anti-parliamentary and it stresses one big union. Others helped set up the official Communist Party, which is still going, in which there's a small anarchist current. So I would say we can definitely say that in South Africa, there is a significant impact onto the larger local population, as well as a significant impact on the trade union movement, both black and white. And there is a significant amount of cooperation and even in some cases overlapping membership with the black and colored nationalist groups, the International Socialist League and the Industrial Workers of Africa. In 1918, for example, there's a joint trial of members of the International Socialist League, the Industrial Workers of Africa, and the African National Congress in Johannesburg for trying to start a general strike. And the interesting thing is, of the people on trial, most of them are members of all three organizations: the International Social League, Industrial Workers of Africa, and the African National Congress. All right, so I think we get quite a significant spread. And I should just mention here as well that the ICU trade union, which, as I said, was influenced by anarchism and syndicalism, but wasn't, strictly speaking, syndicalist, spreads across the region. So it spreads to Namibia, or Southwest Africa, formerly German Southwest Africa, which is taken over by South Africa. It goes there in 1920. It's in Luderitzbucht, later in Elizabeth Bay, and also in Walvis Bay. It also spreads in 1927, this is the ICU, into Swaziland, now called Eswatini, and Zimbabwe, into Lesotho in 1928, and into Zambia in 1931. I just want to make a short note on Kenya, and then we'll start getting on the other phase where I won't be as detailed. In Kenya, there's an influence by the Ghadar Party, which is a revolutionary Indian movement, South Asian movement, which is somewhat influenced by the IWW, and it has some influence in India. So that's an interesting side note. Look, from the 1930s to the 1970s, anarchism and syndicalism do decline in Africa. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One of those reasons is repression. The Portuguese home country, as well as the colonies, go under a dictatorship from 1926. So there's no space for free trade unions. There's a suppression of any sort of independent left-wing press. Strikes are put down by the army. That's part of it. Part of it is also that communism is rising. And many anarchists and syndicalists move over to communism. This is the case in South Africa, where the International Socialist League's veterans become the early cadre of the South African Communist Party. There's similar things happening in France and thus in Algeria, where the French Communist Party is active in both, to some extent in Egypt. So the middle of the century, things are quite quiet, and there's also an upsurge in anti-colonial struggles. And the forces that come to dominate the struggles in that period are very much Marxism, Leninism, and nationalism, Arab nationalism or black nationalism. These become the major forces. And with the anarchists often being a little bit, by this time, quite small, they're often quite marginal. Sometimes they work with these nationalists. For example, the Fédération Communiste Libertaire, which is an anarchist federation in France that is also active in Algeria, works with Algerian nationalists during the Algerian War of Independence, including smuggling weapons for it, couriering documents, and raising funds. The Fédération Communiste Libertaire works in particular with the Mouvement National Algérien of Ahmed Ben Messalil Hajj, not with the FNLA of Ben Bella. In other cases, you find anarchists and syndicalists moving into Marxist-Leninist organizations. So one of the most important local anarchists in Angola is a mestizo called Inocencio Camara Pires. And he's active in Brazil, he's active in Europe, he's active in support for the Spanish Revolution. By the 1960s, he is working essentially as a foreign representative of the Marxist-Leninist Movimento Popular de Liberação de Angola, the MPLA, in Paris. His house is actually pretty much a diplomatic mission. So Pires, for example, I don't know if he ever disavows anarchism, but he moves over to the main Marxist-Leninist force. In Mozambique as well, leading anarchists like Aurelio Quintanilha and Willie Waddington become supporters of the Marxist-Leninist Frente de Libertação de Mozambique, or FRELIMO. And in the case of Mozambique, when FRELIMO takes power, they continue to work with it. Okay, so by the 1990s, really, there isn't really much of an anarchist presence left. There's been a bit of a generational break in many cases. To the extent there are anarchists and syndicalists, they're often isolated individuals. We know of people in Nigeria who are importing anarchist materials in the 1930s and 40s, but they're not really organizing much. We know about isolated anarchists in Angola. There's still a few in Mozambique and so on, but there's not really much. Now, I've done that bit, don't worry. So when we start to see a revival, this is really from the 1980s, but the revival itself is happening in the 1990s. Okay, so we've got to locate the second wave, and I'll talk a bit about that, and we can probably discuss it more when we have a bit of a break. But what's really happening from the 1980s, which is starting to break this ice, this situation where things are locked into these Marxist-Leninist and nationalist projects and colonial wars, is a second modern globalization. From the 1970s, you get a global economic crisis. This massive crisis, besides shaking the Western Keynesian state and the Soviet Union and similar states, bankrupts many independent African governments. Now, many independent African governments, for example, in Zambia, essentially relied on the export of raw materials like copper. This was then used to fund the state, as well as to fund various attempts at industrializing these countries. And of course, it also provided a means for ruling classes to, enrich themselves. The crisis bankrupts many African countries. Zambia, for example, the demand for copper falls through the floor, and the price of copper falls by 3/4, and copper is increasingly substituted by things like optical fiber. So a number of these post-colonial governments start to go bankrupt. The same process also affects the Marxist-Leninist states that have been set up in Africa, which include Angola and Mozambique. They also rely quite heavily on foreign trade. And in addition to that, these Marxist-Leninist states are affected quite heavily by the Cold War. So they're also quite unstable. There's a civil war in Angola and a civil war in Mozambique, for example. But the important thing here is this failure of these state-led development models breaks people's faith in these nationalist and Marxist-Leninist models. It breaks their faith. And then after that, the fall of the Berlin Wall is a shock for many, many on the African left. I mean, the Soviet Union was incredibly admired. And even right now, on a lot of the left in Africa, you'll find huge support for Putin now, not because Putin is a communist, but because the Soviet Union was seen as a power that had helped African independence movements. And it was. I mean, for its own reasons, of course, but the fall of the Berlin Wall really, really shocked many people. And on top of that, these governments, including the Marxist-Leninist ones, started to have to implement neoliberal reforms. So not only were people disillusioned, not only did these older models stop working, but these governments were then increasingly in conflict with their own people. So although these governments had been repressive, they did at least often guarantee jobs, price controls over fuel and food, and these were removed. And this led to massive waves of protest in Africa from really from the 1980s. And many of these post-colonial governments were thrown out of office, and others held on by the skin of their teeth. And at the same time, you start to get the anti-globalization or counter-globalization movement and the World Social Forum process. It has a real impact in parts of Africa. Okay, so we start to see from the 1990s the re-emergence of organized anarchist or syndicalist groups in parts of Africa. In Nigeria, the Awareness League, which is an anarcho-syndicalist group claiming 2,000 or 3,000 members, emerges. And in Sierra Leone, a couple of thousand miners, diamond miners, join the Industrial Workers of the World. In South Africa, from 1991 or so, there are anarchist groups. One of the first is called the Azanian Anarchist Alliance. And in Zambia, in around about 1998. One of the most important, and it's one, most of these photos I'm giving you, and there's not a lot of photos I know, are related to this, the Zabalaza Anarchist Communist Front, which I've managed to misspell. You start to get groups in Kenya. In Kenya, the groups in the 2000s, there's really people involved in anti-globalization. There's a group called Anti-Capitalist Convergence. There's a number of anarchist types in there. In Swaziland, a number of people involved in the pro-democracy struggle. Swaziland is actually, even right now, literally an absolute monarchy, moved to anarchism. And in Zimbabwe, where there's a struggle against both neoliberalism and the ZANU-PF dictatorship of Robert Mugabe, also moved to anarchism. I should just mention here, the Zabalaza Anarchist Front actually then gets members in Swaziland and in Zimbabwe. So it's a bit unwieldy. And we definitely see, and this is an area I don't know much about, but you definitely see in the Arab Spring of the 2010s, anarchists emerge publicly in countries like Tunisia and Egypt. So what are these new movements about? Well, generally speaking, a lot of them are very, very keen on syndicalism. For example, the Industrial Workers of the World, one is set up in Sierra Leone. There are two efforts in South Africa to launch the Industrial Workers of the World. There's a more or less controversial effort in Uganda. The Zambians, as I recall, they were keen on forming syndicalist influence in the unions. The South Africans, like Zabalaza, were very keen on working in the existing unions, not really forming new unions. So this is a key thing. I mean, I think it's partly because the trade unions in these countries were very important to these struggles. In Zambia, in South Africa, Swaziland, Egypt, Tunisia, that people have faith in unions. I don't know in the West. I don't know the Western context, but a lot of people were enthusiastic. And I remember, even if you had a debate with somebody on can unions be revolutionary, on the left, it wasn't even a debate. People were like, of course they can. What are you talking about? So there was quite a strong emphasis on unions and that, but there was quite a strong protest culture. I mean, people loved going to protests. And maybe to some extent to the detriment of doing much else, but going to protest was a very big part of it. I think it was very much part of the culture of the anti-globalization movement at the time, which brings me to the point where I can show you some photos and start to wrap up. These two gentlemen in the front are people from the Zabalaza Anarchist Communist Front at a protest in Soweto Township. You can't see it very clearly behind the speaker, but there's a nice big red and black flag. This is an attempt at setting up a food garden and a people's library in Soweto by local anarchists. The anarchists in Soweto, for example, who were part of Zabalaza, set up a residents association in one of the neighborhoods. They tried to set up this food garden. They tried to set up a people's library, including a tool library where you could come and borrow spades and so on. And they were very involved in protests. I'll see if I can even get a bit of video later. And you also got a bit of a countercultural influence. This is from South Africa. You can see the Don't Vote organized, and on the side it says Remember Marikana, which was a site of an infamous post-apartheid massacre of miners. Famously, this man in the green blanket has become a symbol of that. But this is associated with a hip-hop group with an anarchist influence called Sounds of the South. Similarly, in Zimbabwe, was a group called the Toi Arts Collective with a K. So you got quite a wide range of these forms. You know, you got newspapers being published, a lot of people going to protest. Certainly in South Africa, efforts to influence the trade unions, being involved in community movements against cutoffs. I should have mentioned that this stuff in Soweto was tied to people fighting against rising fees for electricity and water, which were very much seen as part of neoliberalism, and people were being cut off. So the Zabalaza Anarchist Communist Front was an associate of a coalition called the Anti-Privatization Forum. In fact, anarchists were among the founder members of this coalition of township-based movements and one or two trade unions, and also helped establish a group called the Motsoaledi Concerned Residents, which was also affiliated to the Anti-Privatization Forum. So there was quite a lot of involvement. I mean, we can unpack things. I mean, you know, I'm happy to take questions about that. Certainly myself, I was, I know quite a bit of that story, some of these things from within. And I mean, there's also a lot of people who were active from the 1990s who are no longer with us. There was a Zabalaza member called MK from Swaziland. He died recently of illness. Wilstar Chungu, who was the founder of the anarchist and worker solidarity movement in Zambia in the late 1990s. He died. I think he had HIV and he picked up an illness. And people got burnt out as well and moved on and so on. But generally speaking, I would say that the big growth seen in the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s has slowed. I think there was a real sense in many countries at the time, certainly in Southern Africa, of possibility. And it really felt like the heavens were open and things were possible. But generally speaking, in South Africa, for example, these days, the left as a whole is it's in a really terrible state. People are tired. The national mood is actually quite cynical and exhausted. And I suspect it's the same in Zimbabwe and Swaziland, where people have bashed their head against the wall in so many struggles and have been pushed back so many times and disappointed so many times that at this stage, the left project as a whole is in a bit of a crisis. And it didn't work out as a simple, the Berlin Wall falls, everyone becomes an anarcho-syndicalist, because that general despondency in the post-colonial situation, including with the second liberation movements, has quite a tiring effect on people. So you'll find many people still active, but often in a small way here and there. Okay, on that not very nice note, there's also good news, but on that not so exciting note, I want to get to this last issue. Can we speak about anarchism in African cultures? Well, I've seen this argument a few times. The Awareness League in Nigeria, for example, made the argument that some African cultures had anarchist elements. And I think, of course, I mean, it's perfectly true. Many cultures around the world traditional cultures around the world have had egalitarian and democratic elements. And I think that's something people can build on. For example, the Irish syndicalist James Connolly always used to argue that traditional Irish culture had anarchistic or had socialist elements. So that's true. But is this anarchism? Well, no. The traditional culture, no matter where it is, isn't anarchist, because anarchism is a modern ideology. It may have synergies with older cultures, and I think it clearly draws on older ideas like natural rights, but they aren't anarchist as such in the technical sense. The last thing I think to be said about culture is that we always need to be very careful about essentializing cultures. Cultures change and they're contradictory. Sayyid Muhammad, the Berber anarchist from Algeria, he argued that the Kabyles in Algeria had many anarchistic elements in their traditional culture, in the Rif and so on. But of course, what a traditional culture was and what it is today are very different things. No one has been unaffected by capitalism. Many older things have been shattered. Many older things have been destroyed. One of the features of capitalism and modernity is precisely, as Karl Marx and Fred Engels once said, that all that is solid melts into air and all that is holy is profaned. They're incredibly destructive forces. So I think there's a lot of value to be had in trying to hold on to positive elements of older cultures, but we can't just assume that what you get now is what you got in 1850 or 1550. The last point on this is that all cultures are contradictory as well. The very same cultures that, for example, the Awareness League of Nigeria highlighted as having anarchist elements were also had very patriarchal elements. So yes, they had a democratic space, but many of those democratic spaces were for men and specifically were dominated by older men. And we should also add here, there's often a bit of a mythology. Look, just like everywhere else in the world, there were feudal African societies. There were African societies that practiced slavery, including plantation slavery. As we see in the post-colonial period, there are many, many African elites that are perfectly comfortable with capitalism. So we should always just be aware that whatever a culture is at any given point, it has contradictory elements. And to some extent, these reflect different class interests, but they also reflect the fact that everything is being reshaped and remade by the current world, which has some positives, but also a lot of negatives. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. I think there's quite a lot of questions we could probably ask. I've just stuck up a list of readings that's probably too small to see, but if anyone wants, I could share it to the organizers and you could have a bit of a read. Some great stuff being done on Algeria, Mozambique, Egypt, Southern Africa, Kenya. But I'll just leave it there. I think, let me take the slide. I'll leave the slide up. Okay, so my talk there is done. I think I can go into questions now and discussion and feedback if people want. Whoops. Hi.
Okay, thanks, Lucien. Are there any questions already? Ihr könnt die Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen und ich übersetze sie dann, wenn ihr wollt.
Oh, I can't see the audience anymore.
No worries. Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, in the case of South Africa, the economic freedom fighters, do they have any relation to the anarchist movement? Is there any historical relationship?
Okay. Yeah, look, the EFF it's a difficult thing to categorize. I mean, its formal politics is that it's a Marxist, Leninist, Fanonist party. But in other ways, it's basically a populist party. And because it also speaks a lot of aspirations, it draws in different elements. I mean, I know that some people in Zabalaza were contacted by people in the EFF who considered themselves to be anarchist, but that's also not unusual because sometimes people in the African National Congress also consider themselves to be anarchists, but are in these broad things. I would say overall the EFF is probably closer to a sort of nationalist populist movement with some left elements. They are labeled, certainly the ANC people call the EFF anarchists, but they don't mean it in the nice way. They mean that these are thugs. Now, I'm pretty sure this is partly in reference to the recent EFF rally, which I think has gone global on social media. So we'll see how the EFF does in the next elections. Oh, I should mention the other thing is the EFF is a very hierarchical organization. Its leader is literally, its title is literally the commander-in-chief, and it has quite a strong militarized element to it. So that would be another issue to think about.
Thanks so much for the talk. I also have a question about South Africa.
Thank
and
you.
I was wondering if you could say something about the class background of lots of these activists.
Okay.
Because in Germany, I think it's very often like actually middle-class kids that are like active in the anarchist movement. And like regarding to that or interlinked with that, if there are any connections between active anarchists and the land squatting movement in South Africa. Or if they, or also with other leftist ideas, or if this like are two totally separate things.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, definitely some of the earlier, I wonder if I can pull up some photos. Some of the earlier anarchist groups in South Africa in the early 90s were among radical university students. So people who were sort of involved in the anti-apartheid movement, which was a mass popular movement by the early 90s. The anti-apartheid movement included high school kids, sports clubs, massive militant trade unions and residents organizations. So some people in that movement were middle class, but they came out of that sector of struggle. Now, there was a very strong push in the 90s to try and embed the anarchist movement in the Black working class, and a core argument of the main anarchist currents, which became Zabalaza. Zabalaza means struggle, was that anarchism and struggle in general in South Africa has to be driven by the Black working class, meaning specifically the Black African working class. And in the 1990s, that meant that the main anarchist group of the time, Workers' Solidarity Federation, targeted and tried to recruit people in the big trade unions. And it became a majority Black, majority worker activist union member organization. In the 2000s, the Zabalaza Anarchist Communist Front, I would describe its composition as a bit of a mix, on the one hand, of some educated middle-class people, some of them white, and then mostly of really poor, long-term unemployed Black youth. So, for example, the comrade who was running that food garden and helped set up the Motsoaledi Concerned Residence in Soweto, he's still active. He's in Cape Town now. He comes from a rural family. He lived in a squatter camp. The building that people were trying to use as the anarchist center was literally a shack. And it was a neighborhood of really about 50-60% unemployment. Now, that came with its own problems, because being based among the long-term, really poor unemployed it's actually harder to organize there than among people in trade unions who've got more resources, who can travel more easily, who, through the trade unions in South Africa at least, have got a lot more, often developed quite a lot of quite sophisticated organizational skills, time discipline, and that. So I'd say, look, the majority of people, certainly that I've met from anarchists in South Africa, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, were pretty salt of the earth, I mean, it reflects the sort of general pattern in the left in South Africa, where you get a few sort of radical intellectuals from various races, and then you get a pretty mostly Black and colored base. And over time, a lot of that base If it's a communist party, that's mostly workers. And if it's the left outside of the communist party, that's often the unemployed and that. Now, that brings me to the issue of the squatters movement. And you're probably thinking of Abahlali, Basaman, Jondolo. Now, that's a very, very interesting and quite complex movement. It's got its own ideology. What exactly the ideology is not clear. They call it Abahlaliism. And it's some elements are libertarian. I mean, their website, for example, last time I looked at Emma Goldman there. You get people in the organization who like Fanon. You get people who like the work of people like Marcus Rediker and Peter Leinbau. But generally speaking, what is really interesting about Abahlali is it stresses self-organization. And that is something that a lot of South African social movements don't have. A lot of South African social movements are protest, and then there's nothing left. And Abahlali literally has set up where it takes over an area. It's more like the MST in Brazil. People will look after the land, they'll farm, they'll defend themselves, and so on. So that is a group that Zabalaza was very sympathetic to, organized protests in defense of, and even once or twice issued a joint statement with. But that's vastly bigger than Zabalaza ever was. I mean, I think it claims 30 or 40,000 members, which is really incredible for a non-trade union group in South Africa and a non-political party.
Thank you very much for your talk. In one presentation we have heard before, there was a comment about anarchist movements in Sudan. As I was getting it right, they are currently there. So, but now I was curious if you could tell us something about it.
I don't know anything about that at all. No, that's actually very interesting. I'd love to find out more. Yeah, I'd love to find out more. I don't know much about it, and any information would be most appreciated. I mean, the one thing about Africa is, I mean, the communications are often very shaped by the old imperial dimensions. So in the English-speaking part like South Africa, you're much more likely to be in contact with people in Nigeria or Kenya than in Sudan or Ethiopia, for that matter, or let alone North Africa. So that's incredibly interesting, and I hope there's something.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm especially interested in state repression against anarchists or the anarchist movement. And I'd like to ask you if there is a specific way or specific modes of state repressions, especially in the late colonial era and post-colonial era, if those African post-colonial states developed a special way of dealing with anarchists and repressing them.
Look, in the colonial era, I mean, it varies a bit, right? So, I mean, in Algeria, for example, we definitely know anarchists were arrested in the 1890s and that, but that was very often for sort of common political offenses. By the time we get to a period like the Algerian War of Independence, the state really ramps up, the French state ramps up its repression. So I must just dig up the French name again. Just give me 1 second. Anarchist newspaper, I think La Liberté was banned. And a number of the leaders of the, let me just try to find the name. It was the Fédération Communiste Liberté. A number of the leaders like Georges Fontanis and that actually had to go into hiding. And I believe the first conscientious objector in the Algerian War of Independence who was jailed was actually an anarchist from the Fédération Communiste Liberté. But look, in the later period, you know, in a lot of the post-colonial and early, the late colonial and early post-colonial period, anarchists weren't that big a factor. I mean, governments were really quite obsessed often with communists, this being the Cold War era. And that was the one level. At another level, many post-colonial governments, if we're talking about Nigeria or Algeria or Egypt or Kenya or Zimbabwe, they didn't want any dissent at all. They clamped down. They were not interested in having any independent civil society. They tried to turn trade unions literally into parts of a party state. And the Marxist-Leninist regimes were the same. So I don't think there was a specific targeting of anarchists. by the time we get to the like 60s, 70s, because anarchists weren't that significant, but there was significant repression of the left in general. And that was itself not unique to the left. There was a generalized repression of any sort of dissent. In Kenya, this week just past, people I know have set up an exhibition about a man called Pio Pinto Gama. He was a Goan Indian who lived in Kenya, and he was assassinated in the 1960s by the new independent government of Jomo Kenyatta. And that was the example of a lot of things that happened. You know, there was a lot of that. Now, in South Africa, it's the state doesn't repress people directly politically, but what you do get when you're dealing in a lot of poorer communities is, and this is where this Abaklali, Basumanjondolo, the squatter, the land occupation movement comes in. You do get at least some politicians use hitmen. So it's not uncommon for a community activist to hear that there is a death order and to go into hiding. And it's not necessarily political repression. A lot of this in South Africa is driven by politicians who use the state as a source of accumulation, and they don't like any challenge. So often corrupt politicians, in particular, and government officials, are the sort of people who'd be inclined to hire a hitman to do something. Now, in terms of, say, with Zabalaza and its experience, it did suffer some repression. One of the Zabalaza comrades in Soweto, he was jailed on election day for protesting at a polling station. This was about 10, 15 years ago. He was arrested at the border post of Swaziland. Some of the Swazi comrades had to flee the country. And Zimbabwe, that's a whole other level of repression. I mean, Zimbabwe, people, it's relaxed a bit now, but back in the day, in the 2000s and 2010s, the state just dealt with you harshly. People would be very careful what you'd say in any public space at all. So it's a bit of a mix. I wouldn't say necessarily directly targeting. There's generally, in the Cold War era, there was definitely an obsession with communists, or if you're Marxist-Leninist, with CIA and counter-revolutionary agents, which in both cases, the effect was pretty much the same. And subsequent to that, from the 1990s, repression is often delivered not so much for political reasons in the sense of this is a real challenge, but in the sense of people not wanting to let go of the levers of state power, which are a major source of class formation, literally getting rich off the state. So it's a sort of state capture sort of thing. I don't think that kind of helps. I should mention that squatter movement, Abaklali, I mean, they've been targeted a lot in KwaZulu-Natal with hit squads and that run by corrupt politicians. Yeah. Any other questions? I can't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now,
Listen?
yes. Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
fine.
It went silent for about 2-3
Tried
minutes.
something,
So after I stopped speaking, then I didn't hear anything. Yeah, it's gone quiet again. Hello?
As you mentioned, in the past, anarchists worked.
I've lost your sound again.
Hello. Test 1, 2.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, it's much too late.
Yeah.
I'll post it in the chat. All right.
Okay. But you can hear me? Is that?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Cool. Freaking technology, huh? It always does something.
So maybe we can give it another try. Okay, now
Okay.
you can
Oh,
read
wait,
the
here it
question in
comes
the chat.
through. Here it comes through about Black nationalists. Yeah. Okay. And in fact, that reminds me of a general point I wanted to make, but I kind of left it out because I was thinking about time. Look, there were definitely cases of anarchists in Africa, both in North Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, working with nationalists. So in Egypt in 1901, anarchists worked with Egyptian nationalists to set up what was called, I think, the Free Popular University in Alexandria. They tried to set up one in Cairo. Certainly in South Africa, the International Socialist League worked with, at some points, the African National Congress, which was then called the South African Native National Congress, and with the African Political Organization, which was a colored group. And then later, of course, we have the case in Algeria where the Fédération Communiste Libertaire worked with some of the Algerian nationalists. Now, I would say, and I think if you look at most of these groups, they were very critical of the nationalists. They were critical of the nationalists. The International Socialist League in South Africa was very critical of the ANC. They referred to them as black bellwethers of the capitalist class. That means people who ring the bell in a church. These are the black bell ringers of the capitalist class. So why did they work with them? I think there were a few reasons. One was that in some of the struggles and on some of the issues with which the anarchists and the syndicalists wished to engage, nationalists were there. This was another group there, and you were, I think the argument was you were obliged in these situations to work together on an issue, but to still express your differences. I think that was part of it. It was where you were in struggle. I think a lot of them also felt, and I don't think they were necessarily wrong in particular cases, that these nationalists were on the right side compared to the colonial power or the apartheid power in South Africa. So the International Socialist League in South Africa, they did say on the one hand, these ANC leaders are a bunch of middle-class guys, they want capitalism, but they're also speaking up for their people. So we don't trust them really, but they're closer to us than the people running the state. Now, I think you can make that argument. Obviously that argument wouldn't apply when the nationalists are in power, because then you'd literally be working with the state, and you're gonna have a really big problem. And I think that's what happened to the communists in Egypt and South Africa. They worked with the nationalists even when the nationalists were in office. And that actually meant that they lost their political independence completely, and found it more and more difficult to actually have any sort of independent political profile. A third reason I think they worked with the nationalists was to try to get access to people who might be sympathetic. So again, I'll talk about the cases I know best. Certainly in the case of South Africa, the International Socialist League held joint meetings with Industrial Workers of Africa, the Syndicalist Union, and the ANC, because this also gave them a platform to speak to many people who would normally maybe go to an ANC meeting, but to expose them to a different set of views. Say, look, we agree with these guys, but look, at the end of the day, your problem is actually capitalism in the state. And it had some impact. So in the case certainly of the Fédération Communiste Libertaire in Algeria, I mean, the argument of Georges Fontenis, who was one of the leading figures, was, look, in a struggle where the French government is crushing the Algerians just because they want independence, we can't pretend this isn't an issue. We have to take some sides. But he also argued that if we don't show some solidarity, no one is going to listen to us. So his argument was that if we just say, all of you guys are wrong, it's morally wrong, because there's something real at stake. Should the Algerians have independence or not? with all the limits of the nationalists. But his other argument was that we would, meaning anarchists, we would get no hearing if we just seemed not to care, if we just said it doesn't matter. So these are complicated things. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I mean, I know Zabalaza, when it was in the Anti-Privatization Forum, found itself obliged to work alongside Trotskyists and some people who are a bit dodgy and all sorts of forces. And it's not easy. I mean, I can say in theory, there's a case to be made, you know, why some anarchists or syndicalists work with nationalists. But, you know, these are very difficult relations. And yeah, I think for me, I would say you probably can't make a principle that you'll never work with non-anarchist groups, but you also can't make a principle that you must always work with non-anarchist groups no matter what. I mean, I think you'd have to see, is it useful in a given moment or not? And what is the cost, which could be quite significant. I don't know if that sort of answers it. I mean, it's obviously a bit of a contradictory thing because, you know, you're saying you want to work with somebody who wants the state and is probably going to be pretty horrible in power. But on the other hand, you might also say that how can you support the freedom of the individual if you don't support the freedom of a people to reject an empire?
Thank you. Can you hear us now? Cool.
I didn't want to disrupt the sound.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have two questions.
Sure.
One is maybe you said you don't know a lot about what's going on in Sudan right now, but then let me ask about the Egyptian uprising from 2011. How did other anarcho-syndicalists on the African continent try and support this, for example? I would be interested in how in the broader region people try to support uprisings and in solidarity with each other. Maybe you know anything about it. That would be.
I don't know
lovely.
enough about that. I mean, this is one of the things. Africa is very regional. So, for example, in Southern Africa, people looked at the Arab Spring more as, hey, this is actually quite an interesting thing to learn from, and you know, can we learn from it? But I don't think there were many ideas on how you could have practical solidarity, and I mean that from the left as a whole. Somebody who knows more about the North would probably be better placed.
All right, thank you.
And French anarchists and that did support, but yeah, beyond that, I don't really know that much.
Thank you. So my other question would be, you mentioned that around the 1900, like end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th, that people like European immigrants that were organizing in unions, that were anarcho-syndicalists, that they could not ignore the racial question at hand. And you said, okay, so they tried to organize in anarcho-syndicalist unions with like black and white workers, with workers of color. Is that the only consequence that was drawn by European immigrant anarchists within existing of racist violence and colonialism at hand? Or were there additional serious efforts by either European immigrant anarchists on the African continent or still in Europe anarchists to try and stand up against racism and colonialism?
Okay, yes, I would say the answer is definitely yes. For example, let's look at the European side first. You know, obviously I gave the example of people like Malatesta joining an actual armed Egyptian rising, but work, for example, by David Turcato, who is currently editing the complete works of Malatesta. I mean, he's done work which shows that, for example, the Italian anarchist press had a sustained anti-colonial critique. And certainly for things in Southern Africa, there's examples like that as well. There is evidence that, you know, some of the Portuguese anarchist press, in particular articles by a guy called, I think, let me just dig up his name. It'll come now. I think Mario Dominguez. Just give me a second. they definitely wrote a lot of very scathing critiques of colonialism in the Portuguese colonies, and they deplored the racial divisions, but they also raised specifically issues around the larger colonial system. And certainly the La Flambeau group in Algeria didn't just treat it as an issue, black and white, unite and fight, but they were very specifically critical. I mean, for example, Sayyid Muhammad, there's a booklet of his writings edited, I think, by Sylvain Balouk, and he was quite clear there. He said, look, when France did the centenary of the conquest of Algeria, so that would be 1930, he wrote a long article in the French anarchist press saying, civilization, I call it barbarism and theft. Anarchists were involved in organizing demonstrations against the centenary of the Algerian conquest. In South Africa, the International Socialist League's program adopted in 1915 included, and this was a very tightly organized syndicalist group, the program included the abolition of all forms of indenture that affect the native worker, the removal of the compound system, which was a particular way of housing black workers, full equality for black and white workers. So I see where you're getting at, because you can always get people say, well, we should all just unite and fight, without looking at the specifics that some groups face. And there were definitely anarchists and syndicalists who just took that sort of colorblind line. But I think the more sophisticated groups like the La Flambeau group in Algeria, the Fédération Communiste Libertaire, certainly the International Socialist League in South Africa, didn't just express a sort of a sentiment of solidarity or a moral outrage, but specifically condemn particular things around colonialism and specifically try to find ways in which this could be abolished. I mean, they always try to link this, and this goes to the thing about the nationalists as well, that ultimately trying to say to people that ultimately the solution would be that you need to, it's not enough just to change your masters. I'll just see if I can just dig up one of these things here. Sorry, I'm just glancing through. Yeah, the paper La Flambeau denounced colonialism. It denounced the Code de l'Indigenat, which is the racist law, as well as the colonial actions in the Rif War. It had to suspend publication for 9 months after 4 members were jailed. It was also critical of the Algerian elite, but rather than dismiss Algerian struggle, it argued that French workers should unite with the Algerian workers in a common struggle. So Sayyid Muhammad wrote here in a longer piece, he clearly saw anti-colonial nationalism as relatively progressive, but limited. So he argued that ultimately your struggle is a struggle not just against the French, because colonialism is a class crime. That involved at its core brutality, expropriation, and racism in the interests of capitalism. So whether those arguments are right or wrong, I think they do indicate a degree of sophistication. And look, this was strong medicine for a lot of people. I mean, I really need to emphasize this, that groups like the International Socialist League in South Africa were deeply disliked by many white workers, deeply, because many white workers in South Africa saw the solution as getting a job color bar and segregation. And then you had these guys saying, well, we should organize black workers to get equal wages and equal rights. And, you know, for a lot of whites, this was too much. No.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you for your personal opinion about the current crisis. For example, the climate crisis and also the war in Ukraine are impacting African countries a lot. And how do you think these current crises shape syndicalism and anarchism, and what reactions or answers they found?
I mean, it's a tricky thing, you know, because like partly, I mean, I must say at the moment, a lot of the left that I'm, you know, familiar with is quite sort of a bit disoriented. Certainly in a lot of the African context that I know, because of the sort of afterlife of Marxism, Leninism and its impact, and the sort of residual affinity for Russia from the Cold War period, discussions get very complicated because there is a strong view among a lot of the left. I'm not saying anarchists, a lot of the left, that the BRICS is a good anti-imperialist counterweight, that Russia is on the right side, and so on. And, this is just a proxy war. So, I mean, that discussion has got a bit stuck. I think anarchists and that are generally trying to find a position which doesn't tie them, either to Russia or America. And while supportive of Ukrainian independence, also doesn't want, it goes to this earlier question about nationalists, just to endorse Vladimir Zelensky. So that's the one. The environmental thing's a bit of a tricky thing because first thing is South Africa is it's like a massive polluter in the world. It's one of the top carbon emitters in the world because our power grid is pretty much based on low-grade coal and very little processing. And we have a massive power shortage, partly for a number of reasons. South Africa is short of electrical power. So we have about 4 hours a day without power. So discussions around climate change get tied into that a bit, where I think a lot of people would be very happy to see renewables so long as they get power. But on the other hand, a lot of people are also sort of, and I'm talking about the working class broadly, just worried about jobs and that. So these are not the best, and I wish I could give you better answers. I would say, generally speaking, local anarchists have been keen on issues around the environment. I don't think in South Africa there's really a big discourse around climate. That is climate change happening. The issue is more, do people care? People don't really get upset, no, it's not happening. But a lot of people just, so the big trade unions will say, yes, we support a just transition. But in practice, they'll just say it at Congress. It doesn't translate into any concrete programs. And when push comes to shove, people say, well, what happens to my job? So I don't know if that quite answers. So South Africa is very happy to take money, the South African state's very happy to take money from the Americans for renewable energy. But for a lot of South Africans, it probably just comes down to will the power be on? But certainly a sense of crisis exists in South Africa. People just, that sort of hope that you had in the 90s is sort of gone. So some people have hope in a new sort of messianic figure like Julius Malema. Others have hope the ANC will be fixed. But in South Africa right now, the number of people who vote in South Africa, I would have to dig up the exact figure, but literally, I think it's just over half the population even votes now. And they're not going politically active elsewhere necessarily. They're just withdrawing. So, for example, the number of people who have voted has fallen by 37% since 1994. The number of people who didn't vote in the last election, I think, jumped about I think it jumped, sorry, I'll have to dig up the figure, but it jumped by millions. And I think this isn't necessarily a sign of people becoming more political. I think it's a sign of people just sort of getting tired. The increase was, there was about 5 million more people didn't vote. So, I mean, even something like economic freedom fighters, probably the eligible voting population in South Africa now is about 34 million. The EFF gets about 1.5 million votes. So whether we'll see people getting involved in politics in other ways is something we can hope for. But in terms of things like climate change and the Ukraine war, I think that general sense of people being stuck is there, and it'll be interesting to see when the ice starts to break again. I hope that gives you a partial answer. Oh, yes, the number of people who didn't vote increased 8 million between the 2014 election and the 29 election, like 8 million. You know, so the number of people who don't vote is now well over the number of people who vote for the ANC or the EFF. But it's not translating into massive popular movements either. So things like the Anti-Privatization Forum have all collapsed. Abaklali is one of the only popular movements still standing. The squatter movement.
Okay, hello. Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first question is that you speak in the beginning, you speak about the Anarchist Black International. So maybe you can tell a little bit more about this. What is this, or does it still exist? And then the second question is that maybe you know that there's a new anarcho-syndicalist international.
Oh, yeah.
And we have some contacts to some countries in Asia and also South America, but no contacts to syndicalist unions in Africa. So do you know networks or groups who are interested in international connection?
Okay, so the Black International of 1881 was the one I was referring to, which I think was it was a successor to the First International. I think the full name was like I'd have to dig up the full name, but I think it was the Revolutionary Socialist International, something like that, which was a very radical socialist international, which really mostly attracted anarchists, but it had affiliates, like I say, in Egypt, also in Mexico, the Haymarket Martyrs, the American anarchists, the International Working People's Association, from which people like Albert Parsons and Lucy Parsons came, was also affiliated to the Black International. I don't think it lasted out the 1880s, and it was the Black International in the sense of the black flag. You know, so it was an attempt to set up a successor anarchist international after the collapse of the anarchist section of the First International, which was by far the majority of the First International. I mean, Marxist mythology aside, most people were in the anarchist-led section of the First International. Now, in terms of contacts, you know, the group that I was aware of that had quite a lot of African contacts was the CNT of Vignoles. I get mixed up with all the splits that happen in French syndicalism, but not the CNT, the Confédération Nationale du Travail, that was linked to the International Workers Association, but the CNT that was closer to CGT in Spain, to SAC in Sweden. They had a summit in 2007 where they had, in Paris, where they had trade unionists from around about 8 or 9 African countries. They had people from Cote d'Ivoire. This is mostly like French-speaking stuff, right? But Cote d'Ivoire, they had from Djibouti, they had from Morocco. So I think they've got the bigger network. I know the Industrial Workers of the World had a group in Uganda, but there was some controversy. I didn't really follow it at the time. I'm just looking up this thing about 2007. This is CNT Vignoles, which I think it had delegates from Morocco, Tunisia, Guinea, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, the Congo. I think that means not the Democratic Republic of Congo, the other Congo, Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Madagascar. So these are places where French would be spoken more. And what is the name of the new Syndicalist International again? Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with so many names. This is the one that the Spanish CNT is in, is that right? The main group of the Spanish CNT.
Yes, it's. I think in English it's the International Confederation of Labor.
Okay. Now I don't know if CNT Vignoles what state it is in these days. But CNT Vignoles definitely they did a lot of efforts at making contact in Africa. Now, whether all of these trade unionists who attended the summit that organized in 2007 were anarchist or syndicalist is a different issue. But of the 250 delegates, most were from Africa, which was quite remarkable. I'm just checking here. Yes, now I know with international. I should say that Zabalaza was definitely closer to that stream of the syndicalists, the Vignoles, CNT Vignole, CGT, Spain, and so on. But I don't know, is the German Free Workers Union, is that part of this new international, or is it with the old, or the other international?
Yes, it's the new international from Cinete, Uzi from Italy, FAO from Germany.
Okay, FAO is in that?
Yes.
But not CNT of Paris? That's not in?
No.
Okay. But they would definitely be the guys, the CNT of Rue Vignoles. But I don't know their current state, what their state of play is. But they definitely had a lot of African contacts. Sorry, I'm just looking up something here. Yeah, I don't know if they're still going properly, but that'll be interesting. That'll be interesting. But again, the language issue is going to be something as well. That's the other thing. And I think IWW is in this new international as well, or part of IWW.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I mean, they would know about the stuff in Uganda, but there was some issue. I didn't follow the micro details. And Solfed in Britain had some contacts in Uganda as well. Yeah. I don't know if that really helps you very much.
Hello.
I mean, it's fantastic to see these links going on in Asia, and that's very interesting indeed.
Of course, I'm a new speaker now. I just wanted to share the name of a federation of like Iran and Sudan.
Wow.
I think it's called Mahabad, Mahabad, Mahabad. I'm also not an expert, of course, but I just wanted to share the name of this federation because you asked for more information. Yeah. Mahabad. I think they are also publishing various texts in English, so it will be accessible. Yes,
that's great.
And I also wanted to share it's not Africa, but a federation of Iran and Afghanistan. I like a side note, it's also really interesting. They have a Twitter account I know of, and also a website. So yeah, just for your information.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So these are very interesting developments. I mean, very interesting. I mean, wow.
Of course. And yeah, I think I'm done because the comrade before dropped my questions as well.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Look, language is always going to be the issue. You know, the French-speaking groups, countries will tend to have more connections with France and so on. I believe there was also a sort of international Mediterranean meeting of libertarians and anarchists about 10 years ago. But I don't track that as much as I should. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something?
I just wanted to say that there are no more questions left here in the room. So thanks very much again for providing us with this insight.
All right, and I'm very happy to do that. Look, if anybody, if people want some list of things they could read or whatever, just email me and I will send that to you. And,
yeah, sure. It would be cool if you send your presentation.
Please just send me a reminder and I'll do that.
Sure.
But there's definitely some very good recent work as well. All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I got to say, I appreciated being able to see the audience. Because one of the things about Zoom, I've done a couple of talks and you don't see anyone. Once I was in a thing and the camera was facing the wall. And I had no idea when I was speaking if people were rolling their eyes or waving their fists or whatever. It's incredibly strange. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate your interest in hosting me and all the very interesting questions. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them. I'd love to be able to answer everything, but I couldn't really. And I wish you the best for the rest of your festival and for your ongoing work. So thank you very much and have a great evening. Your sound is gone. Must I go?
Okay, listen, we turn off. Bye-bye. It was really nice for you, having you here.
Thanks, Sam. Have a good evening further. Cheers, man.